Somewhere in the middle of the largest ocean on Earth, a single canoe moves slowly across the water. There is no land behind it. There is no land ahead. Only the horizon, in every direction, curving away into nothing. The people aboard cannot see where they are going. They have no map, no compass, no metal of any kind. And yet they are not lost. They are following something the rest of the world had not yet learned how to read. Beneath them lies the Pacific, an ocean so vast that it covers nearly a third of the surface of our entire planet. Scattered across it are thousands of islands, most of them smaller than a single town, separated by endless miles of empty sea. To find one of those islands, on purpose, across thousands of miles of open water, should have been impossible. The greatest navies of Europe would not dare a voyage like this for another 1,000 years. And still, these people went. They sailed east, into the rising sun, toward places where no human being had ever set foot. They carried pigs and taro, and the seeds of everything they would need to build an entire world from nothing, on whatever land they might find. And they found it, island after island, until they had reached almost every habitable speck of land inside a triangle of ocean larger than Europe, Russia, and China combined. Hawaii to the north, Rapa Nui to the east, Aotearoa far to the south. No people in all of human history had ever spread so far across so much water with so little. They were the greatest ocean explorers the world has ever known. And yet, almost no one tells their story. For a long time, even the experts refused to believe it was possible. They decided these voyages must have been an accident. Fishermen, blown off course, drifting helplessly until they washed ashore. They were wrong. Every single voyage was a choice. These people left behind no books, no written records, nothing carved in stone to explain themselves. Their entire civilization lived inside human memory, in chant, in song, in the names of ancestors, and in the patterns of the stars overhead. This is the story of the Polynesians, a people who took the emptiest place on the face of the earth and turned it into a home, who built kingdoms and gods, sacred law and unbreakable family, on islands at the very end of the world. You will see how they fished and how they prayed, how they marked their own skin with ink that told the story of a life. You will meet their chiefs, their priests, and the navigators who carried an entire ocean inside their heads. But this is not only a story about the past, because the same ocean that once carried these people to safety, 3,000 years ago, has now begun, slowly and quietly, to turn against the children they left behind. Today, on some of those low islands, the sea is rising. The salt water is creeping over the gardens and into the wells, and an entire nation of Polynesian people is preparing, with heavy hearts, for the day their homeland may vanish beneath the waves forever. So how did they get here? How did one people conquer the largest ocean on Earth and then find themselves fighting to stop that same ocean from swallowing them whole? To understand that, we have to go back. Back before the kingdoms, back before the gods, back to a single canoe and an empty waiting sea. Close your eyes and feel it first. The heat. Not the warmth of a summer afternoon, but a thick, wet weight that settles on your skin the moment the sun clears the horizon. Here, near the equator, the day does not begin gently. It arrives. Beneath your feet, the sand is not white. On the youngest islands, it is black. Black because this land was not slowly built. It was vomited up from the floor of the ocean by fire, cooled by the sea and left smoking on the surface of the world. Turn inland, and the island becomes a cathedral of green. Mountains rise so steeply they seem to lean over you, their peaks lost in cloud. Waterfalls pour from ledges you cannot see, and the jungle climbs every slope in a tangle so dense the sunlight barely reaches the ground. And it is loud. Not with the noise of machines, but with life. The shriek of seabirds wheeling over the cliffs, the constant hiss of the trade wind through the palms, And beneath all of it, never stopping, the low and endless drumming of the surf. Step into the shallows and the world changes again. Just below the surface lies the reef, a living city of coral, glowing in impossible colors. Fish in electric blue and gold drift past in their thousands. It looks like a paradise. It is also a trap. For that beautiful coral is sharp as broken glass. A single careless step can open the skin to the bone. And where the reef ends, the waves rear up and break with a force that can splinter a canoe. And the body inside it, against the rock in a heartbeat. Inside that ring of reef, though, lies calm. The lagoon. A sheet of water so clear and so still it mirrors the sky, glowing every shade of turquoise and jade. Here, the water is warm, the fish are easy, and for a moment, the ocean forgives you. But sail beyond the reef, past the line where the turquoise drops away into bottomless blue, and the forgiveness ends. Out there, the ocean is miles deep and utterly indifferent. There is no sound but wind and water, and no help in any direction for 1,000 miles. And not every island is a green mountain. Far out, scattered across the deep, are the atolls, thin rings of white sand and palm looped around a lagoon, barely a few feet above the sea, so low and so flat that from a distance they seem to float on the water itself. On these atolls, there are no rivers, no mountain streams. When the rains fail, there is no fresh water but what falls from the sky and what little the sand can hold. Here, beauty and hunger live side by side, and the line between the two is a single dry season. Above it all hangs the sky, and the sky is never still. For these people, it was a clock, a calendar, and a warning all at once. A certain shape of cloud meant land. A certain color at sunset meant the weather was about to change its mind. And when the sky turned against you, it did so without mercy. A squall could rise out of a clear morning in minutes. The wind would scream, the sea would stand up in gray walls, and the rain would fall so hard it erased the difference between the ocean and the air. Worst of all came the great storms, the cyclones, spinning monsters wider than the islands themselves that could strip a village from the earth, flatten the forests, and send the sea surging straight across the low atolls, swallowing them whole before retreating as if nothing had ever been there. Yet when the storms passed, the nights could take your breath away. With no other light for 1,000 miles, the stars came down so close you felt you could touch them, and the dark water itself would sometimes glow, as if the ocean had swallowed the sky. This was the world they chose to call home, a place of staggering beauty and constant danger, where the same ocean that fed you could drown you, and the same sky that guided you could destroy you. To live here, you had to understand both faces of it. And they did, better perhaps than any people who have ever lived. But to understand how they came to read this ocean like the lines of their own hands, we have to go back to the very beginning, to where they came from, and how they got here at all. For centuries, this was the great riddle of the Pacific. When European ships finally crossed this ocean, they found people already living on nearly every island, no matter how small or how remote. People who spoke related languages, worshipped related gods, and looked, in many ways, like one enormous family. But how? How had they possibly gotten here? The early theories were wild. Some imagined a sunken continent, a lost land that had broken apart and left these people stranded on its mountaintops. Others insisted the islands must have been settled by accident, by fishermen blown out to sea, drifting until they happened upon land. Both ideas were wrong. The truth was far more astonishing. To find where the Polynesians truly began, you have to leave the open Pacific behind entirely. You have to travel west, thousands of miles, all the way back to the edge of Asia, to an island that today we call Taiwan. For it was here, around 5,000 years ago, that the story really starts. The people who lived there were farmers and fishers, and they shared something rare in the ancient world, a restless genius for the sea. They spoke an early form of a language family we now call Austronesian, and one day, for reasons we will never fully know, Some of them pushed their boats off the shore and began to move. Their secret was a single brilliant invention, the outrigger, a second, smaller float attached to the side of the canoe by wooden arms that kept the whole vessel from rolling over in the open swell. It seems simple, but it changed everything. It turned a fragile dugout into a craft that could cross horizons. Generation after generation, they island-hopped southward, down through the Philippines, across the scattered lands of what is now Indonesia, always pushing into new waters, always carrying their language, their plants, and their animals with them. This was not one great voyage. It was a slow, unstoppable tide of people, spreading across the sea like a rising tide across sand. Eventually, they reached the Great Islands near New Guinea. And here, something important happened. They met other peoples who had been living in these islands for tens of thousands of years already. The newcomers and the older inhabitants mingled, traded, and married. And out of that meeting, a new culture was born. We know this culture today by a strange name. Lapita, named after the place where its traces were first dug from the ground, and its signature, the thing that lets us track these people across the centuries, was their pottery. Beautiful clay vessels, stamped all over with intricate geometric patterns, pressed into the wet clay with a tiny toothed comb. These Lapita people were the true ancestors of the Polynesians. They were farmers who carried taro and yams, sailors who built ever larger canoes, and they were driven by something we still don't entirely understand: a hunger to see what lay beyond the next stretch of empty sea. And so, around 3,300 years ago, the great push into the unknown Pacific truly began. In just a few short centuries, an eye blink in the long story of humankind, they leapt outward, to the Solomon Islands, to Vanuatu, to New Caledonia, conquering distances no human beings had ever dared before. They reached the islands of Fiji, and then, pressing still further east, around 3,000 years ago, they made landfall on two island groups that would become the very cradle of a new civilization. Two names you should remember: Tonga and Samoa. And then, the most mysterious thing in the entire story happened. The Great Expansion, which had swept across thousands of miles of ocean in just a few centuries, suddenly stopped. For roughly 1,000 years, the descendants of the Lapita stayed in Tonga and Samoa and went no further east. Scholars call it the Long Pause. Why did they stop? We still argue about it today. Perhaps the open ocean ahead was simply too wide, the islands beyond too far apart to risk. But during those long, quiet centuries, something extraordinary was taking shape. The people of Tonga and Samoa were no longer just Lapita. They were becoming Polynesian. Their language deepened. Their gods took on new names and new stories. Their chiefs grew in power, tracing their bloodlines back to the heavens. And their canoes changed too. The single outrigger gave way to something far greater. Two full-sized hulls, joined side by side, with a deck built across them. The Voyaging canoe. This new canoe was a miracle of design. Stable enough to ride out a storm. Large enough to carry dozens of people, their families, their animals, and enough food and water to survive for weeks at sea. It was not a boat. It was a lifeboat, carrying an entire world. And with it, the long pause finally ended. Around 2,000 years ago, the voyages east resumed. And this time, nothing could stop them. They sailed into the loneliest waters on the planet, where islands were separated not by tens of miles, but by hundreds. First, they found the rugged, soaring cliffs of the Marquesas. From these islands, they spread out across the eastern Pacific like sparks from a fire. The lush Society Islands, with Tahiti at their heart, became a great hub of culture and power, alive with temples and chiefs and sacred ceremony. And from there, the final, almost unbelievable journeys began. They turned their canoes north and sailed for weeks across open ocean until they found a chain of volcanic islands smoking in the middle of the sea. Hawaii. They turned them far to the southeast and reached the most isolated speck of inhabited land on Earth, Rapa Nui, which the world would later call Easter Island. And last of all, they turned south. Far to the south into colder, wilder seas no tropical people had ever known. There, around 800 years ago, they made landfall on two great green islands, the largest land they would ever find. They named it Aotearoa. We call it New Zealand. Stop and think about what they had done. By the time they reached Aotearoa, the Polynesians had settled every habitable island across a span of ocean larger than any empire that had ever existed. Aotearoa was the last major landmass on the entire planet to be reached by human beings. The Polynesians got there first. And they did it all without a single written word. No charts, no logbooks, no instruments. Everything they knew, every route across the sea, every star, every ancestor's name, was held inside the human mind and passed from the old to the young by voice alone. They built memory palaces out of song. Long chants that listed every island, every chief, every voyage, stretching back dozens of generations. To forget the chant was to lose the map. So they did not forget. They recited and they remembered, with a precision that puts our written records to shame. And the canoe carried more than people. In its hulls traveled the seeds of an entire way of life. Taro and breadfruit and banana shoots, wrapped and kept alive. Pigs, dogs, and chickens. Even the gods themselves, carried in carved images, sailed east with their people to be planted in new soil. So when those first European sails finally appeared on the horizon centuries later, they were not discovering empty islands. They were arriving very late, in a world that had already been mapped, named, and made home by one of the boldest peoples the Earth has ever produced. But long before any of that, on those newly settled islands, ordinary life had already taken root. The fires were lit, the gardens were planted, children were born who would never know the homeland their grandparents had left behind. So what was it actually like to wake up and live a single day in this world they had built? Let's step ashore and find out. The day here does not begin with a sound. It begins with a smell. Wood smoke, drifting low through the cool air, as the first cooking fires are coaxed back to life in the dark. Above the village, the last stars are fading. And one by one, the people of the island begin to stir. The first to leave are the fishermen. While the lagoon is still gray and glassy, they carry their canoes down to the water's edge, slide them through the shallows, and paddle out toward the gap in the reef. Timing is everything. To miss the tide, or to misread the surf, can cost a man his life. Their gear is a marvel of patience. Hooks carved from polished pearl shell and bone, shaped so cleverly that the fish hooks itself. Lines twisted from plant fiber, strong enough to hold a thrashing catch. And nets, woven by hand over many weeks, weighted with stones and floated with light wood. Out beyond the reef, in the deeper water, the real skill begins. A good fisherman knows the secret places. The spots where the big fish gather, marked by nothing more than a particular swirl on the surface, or the angle of a distant peak lined up against the shore. This knowledge is precious, and it is passed only to a trusted son. While the men are at sea, the reef itself becomes a second garden. As the tide pulls back, the women and children wade out across the exposed coral flats, baskets on their hips, eyes scanning the rock pools for anything that moves. This is daily work, and it almost never fails to feed the family. The reef gives up its treasures slowly, to those who know how to look. An octopus, betrayed by a single tentacle curling in a crevice. Spiny sea urchins. Clams wedged into the coral. Small bright fish trapped in the shrinking pools. Each one a mouthful, and together a feast in the making. But the heart of the island's food is not in the sea at all. It is in the soil. Walk up the slope behind the village, and the wild jungle gives way to something carefully shaped by human hands. Terraces. Step after step of flooded garden beds, cut into the hillside, fed by streams channeled from above. This is taro, the staff of life across much of Polynesia. Its leaves are eaten like greens. Its thick root, pounded into a soft paste, is the food that fills the belly at nearly every meal. Tending it is endless work. The beds must be weeded, the water kept flowing, the soil turned with a simple wooden digging stick. Around the gardens grow the great providers. The banana, heavy with fruit. The coconut palm, which gives food, drink, oil, rope, and timber all from a single tree. And the breadfruit, whose huge green globes, roasted in the fire, taste like warm bread and feed a family for free, from a tree that asks for nothing. A young man scrambles barefoot up a smooth palm trunk, 20-30 feet into the air, with nothing but a loop of fiber around his ankles and the strength of his own arms. At the top, he twists free the heavy coconuts and sends them thudding to the ground below. It is a skill learned in childhood and never forgotten. Down in the village, the houses themselves tell you how clever these people are. Built without a single nail. The frame is strong timber, lashed together at every joint with coconut fiber cord, tied in patterns so tight and so precise that the whole structure can flex in a storm without breaking apart. The roof is a thick thatch of woven palm or pandanus leaf, layered so deeply that the heaviest tropical rain simply runs off it. The walls are often open to the breeze, or screened with woven blinds that can be raised and lowered. It is a home perfectly designed for its world. Cool, dry, and strong. Inside, you will find very little. A few finely woven sleeping mats rolled against the wall, some wooden bowls, a bundle of tools, bark cloth folded neatly away. These people do not measure wealth in objects piled up and hidden. They measure it in skill, in family, in generosity, and in mana. And every one of those finely made things began with a tool of stone. The most important is the adze, a blade of hard volcanic rock, ground for days to a razor edge and lashed to a wooden handle. With nothing but this, a skilled craftsman can fell a giant tree and hollow it into a canoe. There are tools for everything. Scrapers and peelers made from sharp shell, files made from rough coral and the rasping skin of a stingray, needles of bone for sewing and tattooing, fish hooks, drills, chisels, and pounders. An entire workshop built from the bones of the land and the sea, without a scrap of metal anywhere. Near the houses, the women's work hums along all day. Foremost is weaving. Long leaves of the pandanus tree are stripped, softened, and split into fine strips, then plaited into mats and baskets with astonishing speed and skill. The finest mats take months to make and are treasured for generations as the truest form of family wealth. And then there is the sound that defines the village afternoon. A steady, rhythmic pounding, echoing from house to house. It is the making of tapa, bark cloth. Strips of bark are stripped from young trees, soaked and then beaten, for hours, with a heavy wooden mallet, until they spread and fuse into a soft, paper-thin sheet. The finished cloth is decorated with bold patterns, stamped and painted in browns and blacks made from plants and soot. And it is everywhere in island life. It is clothing and bedding. It wraps newborn babies and honored dead. It is given at weddings and to chiefs. A roll of fine tapa is a gift fit for a king. Through all of this, the children are everywhere and never idle. There is no schoolhouse here. A child learns by watching, then by doing. A small boy is handed a tiny paddle. A small girl is given a few leaves to weave. They absorb the work of survival the way children everywhere absorb their mother tongue, simply by living it. And of course, they play. They wrestle and race on the sand. They fly down the slopes on sledges. And above all, they swim. By the age of 4 or 5, an island child is more at home in the water than on the land, diving and laughing in the lagoon like it is the most natural thing in the world. Because here, it is. Down by the shore, the canoe builders bend over their work. Carving a great voyaging canoe can take a year or more, and it is sacred work, surrounded by ritual. The master shapes the hull. His helpers lash the planks. And slowly, from a single felled tree, the most important object in the entire culture takes form. And binding all of it together, literally, is rope. Coconut fiber, soaked and pounded and then rolled against the thigh into strong cord, called senet. Everything in this world is lashed, not nailed. Houses, canoes, tools, weapons. The making of senet is a constant, endless task, often done by the older men as they sit and talk. By the middle of the day, the sun stands directly overhead, and the heat presses down like a hand. Work slows. People drift into the shade of the houses and the trees. Some doze. Some talk quietly. A bowl of cool coconut water passes from hand to hand. The whole island seems to breathe out and rest. What holds this whole community together is a rhythm older than any one of them. Everyone has a place. Everyone has a task. No one survives alone, and no one is meant to. The fisherman, the gardener, the weaver, the builder, the chief, the priest. Each is a single thread, and together they are one cloth. As the heat eases, attention turns again to the body itself. The people here take great care in how they appear. Skin is rubbed with fragrant coconut oil until it gleams. Hair is dressed and adorned. Sweet-smelling flowers are tucked behind ears and woven into garlands worn around the neck. To be well-groomed is to show respect for yourself and for others. Visitors come and go between villages along the coast. A canoe arrives bearing relatives from the next bay, or goods to trade. A fine mat for a stone odds. Dried fish for garden food. With every exchange comes news, gossip, marriage arrangements, and the renewing of the bonds that tie distant families into one people. And then the men return from the sea. The cry goes up along the beach as the canoes are spotted, riding low and heavy with the day's catch. Strong hands haul the hulls up onto the sand. The fish are counted and shared out, for here, a good catch belongs not to one man, but to the whole community. As the sun sinks toward the sea, the cooking fires are built up once more, and the smell of the evening meal fills the air. Families gather. The food is laid out on broad green leaves, and before anyone eats, in many homes, a portion is set aside, an offering, for the gods and the ancestors who watch over them still. With full bellies and the day's work done, the night belongs to the voice. Elders gather the young around the fire and tell the old stories, the deeds of heroes, the journeys of the ancestors, the doings of the gods. This is how a child learns who they are and where they come from, in a world with no books at all. There is music, too, the deep rhythm of a hollow log drum, voices rising together in song. Sometimes the slap of dancing feet on the ground, bodies moving in the firelight to mark a birth, a harvest, or simply the joy of being alive on the island another day. At last, the fires burn down to embers. The mats are unrolled. The voices fall quiet, one by one, and the village sleeps, wrapped in the warm dark, beneath the same stars that guided their ancestors here, with the endless sound of the surf rolling in, as it has every single night since the very first canoe arrived. This was daily life. Not a struggle for bare survival, but a rich, ordered, deeply social world, repeated day after day, season after season, for generation upon generation. And at the very center of it all, holding everything together, was the most powerful force in any human community: food, and the extraordinary ways these people found, gathered, and prepared it. On a remote island, food is never something you simply find. It is something you understand. The Polynesians were among the greatest providers in the ancient world, not because their islands were generous, but because they had learned, over thousands of years, to coax abundance out of land and sea that could just as easily have starved them. The ocean was their greatest larder, and they harvested it in a dozen different ways. They knew which fish ran with which season, which bait drew which catch. They read the water the way a farmer reads a field. And nothing was wasted, from the largest tuna to the smallest reef fish trapped in a tide pool. The boldest of them were the divers. With a single deep breath, a man could slip beneath the surface and stay down far longer than seems possible, gliding along the reef with a slender spear, choosing his target, and striking with a speed the fish never saw coming. It was hunting underwater, on one held breath. Far out in the deep blue, they chased the fast-schooling fish, the bonito and the tuna. For these they used a lure of polished pearl shell, trailed behind a speeding canoe. The shell flashed in the sunlit water like a darting fish, and the hungry predators struck it without ever suspecting the hook hidden inside. At times, the whole village fished together. The men would wade out in a great line, beating the water and dragging long sweeps of woven coconut leaf, herding hundreds of fish before them into the shallows or into stone traps built across the reef. It turned a simple meal into a celebration of teamwork. From the land came other foods. The Polynesians kept 3 precious animals, brought across the ocean in the canoes of their ancestors: the dog, the chicken, and most prized of all, the pig. These were not everyday meat. A pig was wealth on 4 legs, raised for months, even years, and saved for the great occasions. And then there were the staples that filled the belly at every meal: taro, pounded soft, sweet potato, yam, banana, and the great green globes of the breadfruit. These were the foundation, reliable, filling, and grown by every family. The fish and the pig were the flavor, but the gardens were the life. But the sea was fickle, and the rains did not always come. So these people became masters of saving food against the lean times. Surplus breadfruit was buried in deep leaf-lined pits, where it slowly fermented into a sour paste that could keep, astonishingly, for years. In a famine, those pits could mean the difference between life and death. Fish were split and dried hard in the sun. Foods were salted with seawater. This knowledge of preservation was not just for hard times. It was what made the great ocean voyages possible in the first place. You cannot sail for a month across empty sea on fresh fish alone. You sail on food that has been made to last. Yet for all this careful daily work, there were days when the whole village set out to do something extraordinary. A birth in the chief's family, a wedding, a visit from an important guest, a harvest, or a victory. On days like these, the people came together to prepare the greatest meal their world could offer: the feast. And at the heart of that feast was a way of cooking so perfect, so deeply loved, that it is still alive across Polynesia today. The earth oven, known by many names across the islands: the umu, the imu in Hawaii, the hang in New Zealand, and the dish above all others to come from it: a whole pig, slow-cooked beneath the ground until it falls from the bone. It begins early, with the men digging a wide, shallow pit in the earth, perhaps a meter across and just as deep. Into it they pack a careful fire of dry hardwood, and on top of that fire, they lay the most important ingredient of all. Not food, stones. Round, dense volcanic stones chosen because they can soak up tremendous heat without cracking apart. The fire is lit, and now comes patience. For 2 hours, sometimes 3, the wood burns down and the stones drink in the heat until they glow a deep, dangerous red. While the men tend the roaring fire, the women begin the real artistry of the meal. And there is a great deal of it to do. The women gather around the food in a busy, practiced circle. The pig is cleaned and rubbed all over with coarse salt drawn from the sea. Taro and sweet potato are peeled. Breadfruit is halved, and whole fish are laid out, ready to be wrapped. Their hands move quickly, and they have done this many times before. The women's most delicate task is the wrapping. Tender young taro leaves, soft as cooked spinach, are folded around morsels of fish and dollops of rich coconut cream, then bound into neat little parcels with strips of leaf. Each bundle is a tiny gift, sealed up to steam slowly in its own juices beneath the earth. When at last the stones are glowing white-hot, the moment of truth arrives, and it must be done with speed. Using long green poles, the men spread the burning stones into an even bed across the bottom of the pit. The heat that rolls off them is fierce enough to scorch the eyebrows from a careless face. Over the searing stones, they throw a thick green cushion of banana stalks and leaves. It hisses and steams violently on contact. This layer does two things. It protects the food from burning on the bare stone, and as it heats, it releases a flood of fragrant steam that will do the actual cooking. Now the centerpiece goes in. The whole salted pig is lifted by many hands and laid carefully onto the steaming bed of leaves. To cook it through from the inside as well, some of the smaller hot stones are wrapped in leaves and tucked deep into its belly. It is heavy, awkward, dangerous work, and everyone helps. Around the pig, every other gap is filled. The little taro leaf parcels, whole breadfruit and sweet potatoes, bundles of fish, baskets of taro root. Nothing goes to waste, and the heat of the stones is shared by everything in the pit. In an hour, the whole feast will be cooking at once, in a single underground kitchen. Then comes the ceiling. Layer upon layer of leaves and woven mats are piled over the food, trapping the steam inside. And finally, the whole mound is buried under a thick blanket of earth, packed down tight, until not a single wisp of smoke or steam can escape. The oven is closed, and now the village must wait. For the next several hours, nothing happens, and everything happens. Underground, in the dark and the heat, the trapped steam works its slow magic. The fat melts. The flesh softens. The flavors of pig, fish, leaf, and root mingle and deepen into something no fire above ground could ever achieve. Above, the village goes about its preparations, glancing now and then at the silent steaming mound. While the oven works, the women turn to one last labor of love. Cooked taro root is laid on a smooth wooden board, and with a heavy stone pounder, it is worked, again and again, with rhythmic strokes and a little water, until it becomes poi. A smooth, sticky, pale purple paste, and for many islanders, the very taste of home. At last, the moment everyone has waited for. The earth is carefully brushed away. The steaming mats are peeled back, one layer at a time. And then the final leaves are lifted, releasing a great cloud of fragrant steam into the air, and revealing the feast below, golden, glistening, and cooked to absolute perfection. The pig is lifted out whole, the meat so tender it slides from the bones at a touch. The breadfruit is soft and sweet. The little taro leaf parcels steam in their wrappings. The smell alone is enough to gather the entire village. Hours of labor by every hand have become a single triumphant meal. The food is carried in great heaps and laid out on a long mat of green leaves spread across the ground. The whole community gathers around it, sitting together on the earth. And here, the order of the feast reveals the order of the society. The finest portions go first to the chief, to honored guests, and to the elders. And then, everyone eats. There are no separate plates, no strict portions for the common people. The food is shared freely until everyone has had their fill. For in this world, to feed people generously is the greatest honor a host can claim. A chief is judged not by what he keeps, but by how much he gives away. This was the genius of Polynesian survival. They had turned the simple act of eating into something far greater. Food was not just fuel, it was wealth and worship, and the glue that held families and villages together. A shared meal was a promise. We belong to one another. We will not let each other go hungry. But notice who sat at the head of that feast. Notice who was served first and who served. Because the way these people shared their food was a perfect mirror of the way they ordered their entire world. To understand the feast, you must understand the family, the chief, and the invisible rules of rank that shaped every single life on the island. Every human society needs an answer to a simple question: who is in charge and why? On these islands, far from any larger world, the answer was woven into the very blood of the people. Polynesian society was not built on wealth or on weapons alone. It was built on rank, and rank began at birth. At the very top stood the high chief. In many islands, he was called the Ariki. He was not simply a powerful man. He was believed to be descended in a direct and unbroken line from the gods themselves. His authority did not come from the people. It came down from the heavens, through his ancestors, into him. With that divine descent came enormous responsibility. The chief was the steward of the land and the sea, of the harvests and the fishing grounds. He settled disputes, led in war, and stood between his people and the gods. His success was their abundance, and his failure could mean their ruin. Because he carried the power of the gods inside him, the chief's very body was dangerous, sacred. In some islands, no one could touch his head, or even let their own head rise higher than his. His food was prepared apart. His name could not be spoken lightly. He lived surrounded by a wall of sacred restriction. Below the high chief spread a great ladder of rank. It was all a matter of bloodlines. The eldest son of the eldest son stood high. The children of younger brothers stood a little lower. Every family knew exactly where it sat on that ladder, and exactly how it was related to the chief above them. This is why genealogy was so precious. A person's place in the world was their line of ancestors, recited like a sacred chant, stretching back generation after generation, often all the way to the gods. To know your genealogy was to know who you were. To forget it was to become no one at all. Most people, of course, were commoners. The farmers, the fishers, the weavers, the great working body of the island. They were not slaves, and they were not despised. Their labor fed everyone, including the chief, and their skill was respected. The island simply could not exist without them, and everyone knew it. But rank was not the end of the story. For alongside the power you were born with, there was a power you could earn. The Polynesians called this kind of sacred force mana. And while a chief inherited great mana, any person could increase their own through courage in war, wisdom in counsel, or above all, generosity. And just as mana could be gained, it could be lost. A chief who ruled unwisely, who was defeated, or who let his people suffer, would see his sacred power drain away. His authority would crumble. In this way, even the most god-descended ruler could fall, if he failed the people he was born to protect. There was also a special class of people set apart by their knowledge, the masters, the experts. Across Polynesia, they were known by names like Tufuga or Kahuna. These were the keepers of the most important skills, and their craft was treated as something close to sacred. To learn it took a lifetime of devotion. There were masters of every great art. The navigator, who held the routes across the ocean in his memory. The canoe builder, whose work carried whole families to safety. The healer, who knew the plants. The priest, who spoke to the gods. And the tattoo master, who marked the very skin of his people with meaning. And what of the women? In a world so concerned with bloodlines, high-born women held real power, for it was through them, as much as through men, that sacred descent flowed. A woman of high rank could command great respect, hold sacred status, and in some islands even rule in her own right. Daily roles between men and women were divided, but they fit together like two halves of a single whole. Men fished the deep sea, built the canoes, and fought the wars. Women tended much of the food, wove the precious mats that were the truest family wealth, and held the household together. Neither could thrive without the other, and all of it rested on one foundation: the family. Not the small family we know today, but a sprawling web of grandparents, parents, children, cousins, and ancestors, living and dead. You were never just an individual here. You were a link in a chain, bound by duty to those above you and care for those below. This whole system was held together by obligation flowing in every direction. The commoner gave labor and loyalty upward. The chief gave protection and generosity downward. Gifts were given and returned, favors owed and repaid. It was an invisible economy of duty, and it kept the entire island bound as one. But behind every part of this world, behind the chief's sacred body, the masters guarded knowledge and the careful rules of who could touch what and sit where. lay two ideas more powerful than any chief: mana and tapu. To truly enter the Polynesian mind, we have to understand them. And that means stepping into the world of the sacred. Yet before we cross into that unseen world, there is something we have to see first. Because everything these people believed, everything they were, poured out into the things they made and the things they did: their art, their voyages, their dance, their ink. This was the dazzling, living culture of the Polynesians, and it is where their genius shone brightest of all. A people can be judged by what they make and by what they hold sacred. And here, the Polynesians had no equal. Out of wood and shell and bone, out of the human voice and the human body, they built a culture of breathtaking richness. And at its very summit stood the greatest achievement of all: the art of finding your way across the sea. The voyaging canoe itself was a masterpiece, a year or more in the making, shaped with sacred ritual at every step. But a canoe is only as good as the person steering it. And to cross hundreds of miles of featureless ocean and strike a tiny island dead-on, with no map and no instrument, required a kind of human being almost beyond belief: the navigator. The navigator was among the most honored people in all of Polynesia. He carried inside his own head what no library could hold: the position of hundreds of stars, the shape of the ocean's swells, the habits of birds, the color of the water over distant reefs. He did not consult charts. He was the chart. His greatest tool was the night sky. The navigator divided the whole dome of the heavens into a kind of compass, made not of metal, but of stars. He knew the exact points on the horizon where each star rose and set. By steering toward a known rising star and replacing it with the next as it climbed too high, he could hold a course true for an entire night. But what happens when clouds swallow the stars, and there is nothing to see at all? Then the navigator closed his eyes, and he felt. Deep beneath the surface roll the great ocean swells, marching in steady patterns set by distant winds. A master could feel the way these swells passed under the hulls and read his direction through the very motion of the canoe beneath him. This was not a skill you could learn as an adult. It had to be poured into a child. A boy chosen to become a navigator might begin in infancy, laid in a tide pool so that his own body would learn the language of the moving water. From the age of 5, he started memorizing the stars, one by one, night after night, for years on end. And there were other signs for those trained to notice them. A certain land-nesting bird, flying out to fish at dawn and home again at dusk, pointing the way to an island still far below the horizon. A particular tower of cloud, hanging motionless over a peak no eye could yet see. A faint green tint reflected on the underside of the clouds, the color of a lagoon mirrored in the sky. The training took decades, and all of it was carried in song. The routes, the stars, the signs, were set to chants that could be sung and remembered perfectly. To become a navigator was to memorize an entire ocean in verse. There was no writing it down. There was only the voice, the memory, and the relentless practice of a lifetime. The stakes could not have been higher. A navigator who made a single great error did not simply get lost. He and everyone aboard would sail on into the empty ocean until their water ran out, and they died. To trust a navigator was to place your life, and the lives of your children, entirely in the keeping of his memory. This is why so much of Polynesian life poured into the act of remembering. Because they had no books, none at all. Every law, every story, every genealogy, every sacred name lived inside human minds, or it did not survive. The Polynesians turned memory itself into an art form, and they trusted it with their entire civilization. The greatest vessel for this memory was the chant. A long, rhythmic recitation, half poetry and half music, that could store enormous amounts of knowledge. There were chants that named every chief back to the gods, chants that recorded ancient voyages, chants for planting, for healing, for war, for grief. The chant was the island's living library. Certain people trained for years to become flawless reciters. A single mistake in a sacred chant was a serious matter, even dangerous, for the words themselves were believed to carry power. The accuracy these reciters achieved, holding thousands of lines perfectly in mind, rivals anything our written records can do. They simply did it with the mind alone, and what the voice preserved, the body brought to life. Across all of Polynesia, dance was far more than entertainment. It was storytelling made visible. With the sway of the hips, the turn of the wrist, and above all the language of the hands, a dancer could tell the story of a voyage, a love, a battle, or a god. In Hawaii, this art reached its height in the hula. Far from a tourist show, the ancient hula was sacred, performed to chant and drum to honor the gods and preserve the old stories. Every gesture had meaning. A rippling hand was the sea, or the wind, or the falling rain. The dancer's body became the story itself. Far to the south, the Maori of Aotearoa developed something fierce and electrifying. The haka, a powerful posture dance performed with stamping feet, slapping arms, bulging eyes, and a thrust-out tongue. Often a challenge before battle, it was also a way to welcome the honored, to grieve the dead, and to bind a people together in a single thunderous voice. In Samoa, dancers performed the graceful siva, all flowing arms and gentle precision. Everywhere across the islands, the forms were different, but the spirit was the same. To dance was to remember, to celebrate, and to belong. No great occasion was complete without it. Driving the dance was the music, the deep boom of drums made from hollowed logs and shark skin, the hollow knock of slit wooden gongs, the haunting breath of a flute played, remarkably, with the nose, and the long, low cry of a conch shell trumpet, carrying for miles to summon the people together. There was one ceremony, though, that was quieter, and in its own way more powerful than any dance. It centered on a drink. Made from the root of the kava plant, it was called kava, or ava, across the islands. Mildly numbing and calming, it was no ordinary refreshment. It was sacred, and surrounded by the strictest formality. The root was pounded, then mixed with water in a great wooden bowl, often with many carved legs, and strained through fiber until it became a cloudy, earthy drink. Every step was done in a set order, watched closely, for to perform the kava ceremony correctly was a mark of deep respect for everyone present. The drink was served in cups of polished coconut shell, and the order of serving was everything. The highest chief drank first, then each person in careful order of rank, so that the ceremony itself displayed the entire social order of those gathered. To be served, and when, told everyone exactly who you were. The kava ceremony welcomed honored guests, sealed agreements between villages, and smoothed the path of diplomacy. To share the bowl was to share trust. It calmed disputes and bound rivals. In a world without contracts or courts, this quiet, sacred drink helped hold the peace between proud and powerful people. But of all the arts of Polynesia, perhaps none speaks to us across the centuries quite like the one carved directly into the skin. The tattoo. To the Polynesians, the body was a book, and the marks upon it told the story of a person's whole life. Their family, their rank, their courage, their place in the world. In Samoa, they told the story of how the gift of tattoo first came to them. Two sisters, the legend says, swam all the way from Fiji, carrying the sacred tools and singing a song that only women should be tattooed. But somewhere along the way, the song became confused, and by the time they reached the shore, it had changed, to say that the men should bear the marks instead. The tattoo was applied by a revered master, the tufuga. In Samoa, this sacred title was passed down within only a few special families, and a young man might train as an apprentice for years before he was trusted to hold the tools himself. To be a master tattooist was to hold one of the most respected positions on the island. The tools were beautifully simple. A small comb of sharpened bone or turtle shell lashed to a wooden handle. A second wooden stick used as a mallet. And ink, made from the soot of burnt nuts, ground into a deep, lasting black. There was no machine, no needle as we know it, only the comb, the mallet, and the human hand. The method was to tap. The master dipped the comb in the ink, set it against the skin, and struck the handle sharply with the mallet, driving the pigment in with a steady, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. An assistant stretched the skin tight and gently wiped it clean. The sound of it filled the air for hours, and for the biggest designs, for many days. And it was agony. There is no gentle way to say it. To receive a great tattoo was to endure hours and days of relentless pain. But that was precisely the point. The pain was the test. To flinch, to cry out, or worst of all to quit before the work was finished, was a lasting shame. To endure it in silence was to prove your strength to the whole community. For a Samoan man, the great mark was the pea, a dense, intricate design that covered him completely from the waist to the knees, so thoroughly that early European visitors swore the men looked as though they were wearing fitted breeches, even when they wore nothing at all. To receive the pea was to become a true man, ready to serve his people. Women, too, received sacred marks. The Samoan malu was finer and more delicate than the man's, flowing across the thighs, its very name carrying the meaning of shelter and protection. It marked a woman's status and her readiness for her place in society, and it was worn with deep pride. In Aotearoa, the Maori created something unmistakable. The tamoko, worn boldly upon the face, its lines were not just tapped in, but carved into the skin with bone chisels, leaving grooves in flesh as well as ink. Each moko was utterly unique, a person's own face turned into a signature of who they were, where they came from, and all they had achieved. For anyone who knew how to read them, these marks were a person's entire history. The patterns could reveal a person's family line, their village, their rank, and the great deeds of their life. A stranger could look upon a tattooed body or face and learn, at a glance, exactly who stood before them. The skin did not lie. And when at last a great tattoo was finished, healed and revealed, it was cause for celebration. The person who bore it had proven their courage, claimed their place, and joined the ranks of those marked as fully belonging. The whole community gathered to honor them. They had paid the price, and now they wore their story for life. The canoe and the chant, the dance and the drink, the marks carved into living skin. Together they formed one of the most extraordinary cultures the human race has ever produced, all of it created and kept alive without a single written word. Yet behind every part of it lay a deeper question that these people carried with them everywhere. What unseen forces truly ran the world? What gave the chief his power, the navigator his certainty, the tattoo its meaning? To answer that, the Polynesians looked beyond the visible world entirely, into a realm of gods, of spirits, of sacred power and forbidden ground. It is time, at last, to enter that world. To the Polynesians, the world you could see was only the surface of things. Beneath every wave, behind every tree, inside every stone and every living person, ran a current of unseen power. For them, the universe was not dead matter. It was alive, crowded with spirits, charged with sacred force, and watched over always by the gods and the ancestors. This was a deeply spiritual way of seeing. A great old tree was not just timber. It held the spirit of the forest. A jagged rock on a headland was not just stone. It might be an ancestor, turned to rock long ago. To walk through this world was to move among living, watching, powerful things at every step. At the center of all their beliefs sat a single idea, one of the most important the Polynesians ever held: mana. There is no perfect word for it in our language. Mana was sacred power, spiritual energy, the invisible force that made a thing what it was, that gave it potency, authority, and life. Mana flowed down from the gods and from the ancestors into the world of the living. A person could be born with great mana, inherited through a noble bloodline. They could gain more through brave and worthy deeds, and they could lose it, drained away by failure or by breaking the sacred laws. Mana was alive, and it could move. The High Chief was believed to be brimming with mana, so much that it made him almost too sacred to approach. It was in his blood, his breath, his very shadow. This was the true source of his authority. People obeyed him not only out of fear, but because they believed his sacred power held the whole community safe. But mana did not live only in people. It saturated certain places and objects too. A sacred grove of trees, a particular pool, a carved image of a god, a chief's most treasured possessions. These things were charged with power, and to treat them carelessly was not just rude, it was genuinely dangerous. And here we meet the second great idea, the shadow and the guardian of mana. Tapu. It is the word that gave us our own word, taboo. Tapu was sacred restriction, a wall of prohibition placed around anything filled with mana, to protect that power, and to protect ordinary people from being burned by it. Tapu was everywhere, and it governed everything. The chief's head was so sacred no one could touch it. A burial ground was tapu, not to be disturbed. While a man received his sacred tattoo, he himself became tapu, forbidden even to feed himself with his own hands. The sacred and the forbidden were woven through every single day. To break a tapu was to commit a kind of cosmic crime. It was believed the offender's mana would be shattered, that sickness, ruin, even death could follow swiftly, sent by the angered gods. And the fear was so deeply held that people who broke a serious tapu sometimes simply sickened and died, convinced their fate was sealed. Yet tapu could also be lifted. The opposite state was called noa, meaning ordinary, free, safe to touch. Through the right rituals, often involving water or food, a person or a place could be returned from the sacred to the everyday. Life moved constantly between these two poles, the sacred and the free. Watching over all of this was a great family of gods. The Polynesian heavens were crowded with them, from mighty creators worshipped across the entire ocean, to small local gods who were once living chiefs raised up after death. But a few towered above the rest, and their names echoed from island to island. Greatest among the sea people's gods was Tangaroa, god of the ocean and of all the creatures within it. For a people whose entire existence depended on the sea, Tangaroa was a god to be honored before every voyage and every catch. The ocean was his domain, and the ocean was their life. There was Tane, god of the forests and of the birds and trees and growing things. It was Tane who, in many tellings, gave shape to the world of light and life. From his domain came the great trees that became the canoes. To enter the forest was to enter the realm of Tane, and to take from it required his blessing. There was Tu, the fierce god of war called upon when blood was to be spilled. And there was Lono, beloved god of peace, of rain and fertility, of the harvest and the gentle seasons. Tu and Lono were like two faces of life itself, the violence of conflict and the abundance of peace. And how did this whole world begin? The Polynesians had a story of breathtaking poetry. In the beginning, they said, there was only the Sky Father, Rangi, and the Earth Mother, Papa. And they were locked together in a tight embrace, pressed so close that no light could pass between them, and the world lay in total darkness. Trapped in that crushing darkness between their parents, lived their children, the gods, and they longed for light and for space to grow. So they made a fateful decision. They would force their mother and father apart and break open the world. One by one, the great gods strained against the sky and failed. Then Tane, god of the forests, lay upon his back, planted his feet against the Sky Father, and pushed with all his strength. Slowly, agonizingly, the sky began to lift. And as Rangi rose away from Papa, for the very first time, light came flooding into the world, and life could begin. But it was a separation paid for in grief. The Sky Father and the Earth Mother had been torn apart forever. And so, the Polynesians said, when the mist rises from the warm ground in the morning, that is the Earth Mother sighing for her lost love. And when the rain falls softly from above, those are the tears of the Sky Father, still weeping for her, far below. And then there was the figure the people loved most of all. Not a distant, terrifying god, but a clever, mischievous, half-divine hero. Maui. Half god and half man, full of tricks and daring, Maui was the great doer of impossible deeds, and his adventures were told and retold around the fires of every island in Polynesia. It was Maui, the stories say, who fished up the islands themselves. Sailing out with a magic hook, he cast deep into the ocean and hauled up the land from the bottom of the sea, dragging whole islands gasping into the sunlight. To this day, some Polynesians call their islands the Great Fish of Maui, and it was Maui, they say, who tamed the sun. In the old days, the sun raced across the sky so fast that the days were too short to finish any work. So Maui snared it with ropes as it rose, and beat it until it promised to slow its journey forever and gave the people the long, full days they have now. But even Maui had his limit. In his final and greatest dare, he tried to defeat death itself, to win immortality for all humankind. He failed, and in his failure the people believed the door to eternal life was closed to us forever. Even the boldest hero, in the end, could not outwit death. To honor these gods, and to keep the channels open between the human world and the divine, the Polynesians built sacred places. Across the islands they were known by names like Moai or Heiau. These were the temples, the holy ground, the thresholds where the world of people met the world of the gods. These were the most Tapu places of all, built of stone platforms and terraces, set with carved wooden images of the gods. They were not for ordinary people to wander into. To set foot on the sacred ground without rite or ritual could cost you your life. Here, the very air was thick with mana. Only one kind of person could move safely in this charged world: the priest. Trained for years in the sacred chants and rituals, the priest was the intermediary, the one who could approach the gods on behalf of the people, carry their prayers upward, and bring back the will of the divine. The gods had to be fed. Offerings were laid upon the sacred altars. The first fruits of the harvest, fish from the sea, pigs from the feast. Whatever was most precious was given back to the gods who had provided it. And in the most desperate times, in some islands, the offering given was a human life. And the gods were not the only ones watching. The dead were never truly gone. Ancestors remained close, present, deeply involved in the lives of their descendants. They could be called upon for help and guidance. They could be angered by neglect. The living and the dead were not separated by a wall, but bound together as one continuing family. And when a Polynesian died, the spirit did not simply vanish. It set out on a journey. On many islands, they believed the soul traveled to a certain point of land, a wild cliff or a westernmost cape, and from that leaping place, it departed across the ocean, returning at last to the ancient homeland from which the ancestors had first come. So the circle closed. The spirit returned, across the very ocean its living body had once crossed, back toward the source of all things. For these people, death was not an ending. It was a final voyage home, the last and greatest journey, for a people who had always been defined by the journey itself. This was the spiritual world the Polynesians carried with them everywhere. A universe alive with power, ruled by gods, and watched by the dead. And out of these beliefs grew some of the most astonishing practices the human race has ever attempted. Practices so strange, so bold, and so unforgettable that the world still struggles to explain them today. Every great culture leaves behind something that makes the rest of the world stop and stare. Something so bold, or so strange, that it seems almost impossible. The Polynesians left behind more than their share, and to find the most astonishing of all, we have to sail to the loneliest inhabited place on the entire planet. This is Rapa Nui. the island the outside world would later call Easter Island. So far from anywhere that its people lived for centuries in near-total isolation, with no one else to talk to but each other, and no one to help them. And in that isolation, they created one of the greatest mysteries on Earth, the Moai. Nearly 1,000 colossal stone figures with heavy brows, long noses, and stern, watchful faces. Some stand taller than a house. The largest ever raised weighed as much as a herd of elephants. They are among the most recognizable objects ever made by human hands, and the people of Rapa Nui carved them all with tools of stone. But the Moai were not gods. They were ancestors. Each great statue was believed to hold the living face and the sacred power of a revered chief or forefather who had passed away. To raise a Moai was to bring an ancestor back to watch over the living, a guardian carved in stone, gazing out across the people he once led. Nearly all of them were born in a single place, a volcanic crater where the rock was soft enough to carve yet strong enough to last. There, master carvers chipped each giant directly out of the cliff face, lying on its back, shaping the face and body in astonishing detail before it was ever cut free from the mountain. That quarry still holds dozens of them, giants caught forever in mid-creation. Some finished, waiting to leave. Some only half-carved. And some so enormous they could never have been moved at all, the dreams of carvers who reached, perhaps, just a little too far. The biggest of these unfinished titans was longer than 5 men lying head to toe. And here lies the great riddle. Once carved, these enormous statues, weighing many tons, had to be moved. Sometimes for miles, across rough and rolling land, from the quarry to the villages where they would stand. How? With no wheels, no metal, no animals to pull them. How on earth did they move the mountain? The people of Rapa Nui had always insisted on one answer, and modern experiments now suggest they were right all along. They said the Moai walked. Standing the statue upright, teams of people worked ropes from each side, rocking it left and right so that it lurched forward, step by step, almost as if it were striding across the island on its own. At their destination, the Moai were hauled upright onto great stone platforms called ahu, often with their backs to the sea. They faced inward, toward the village, so that the ancestors could keep their eternal watch over their descendants. Lined up in a row, gazing out over the living, they must have been an overwhelming sight, but the story carries a warning. Building so many giants demanded enormous resources, and over time the island's strength was strained to its limit. In later years of hardship and conflict, many of the great Moai were toppled from their platforms, thrown down face first into the earth. The guardians had fallen. It is a sobering reminder of how even the mightiest works can come undone. As the age of the Moai faded, the people of Rapa Nui turned to a new and dangerous ritual, the contest of the Birdman. Each year, champions raced down sheer cliffs, swam through shark-filled waters to a tiny offshore islet, and waited, sometimes for days, for the first seabird egg of the season. The man who carried it back unbroken won glory and power for his entire clan. Thousands of miles away, in the lush society islands around Tahiti, a very different kind of wonder traveled the seas. A secret, sacred society of performers, unlike anything else in the ancient world. They were called the Arioi. The Arioi were devotees of a powerful god, and they were drawn from every level of society, chosen for their talent and their devotion. To join was a great honor, marked by tattoos that showed your rank within the order. They were entertainers, but they were also holy, artists who were also priests. They sailed from island to island in great fleets, and wherever they landed, life stopped. They staged spectacular performances of dance, drama, music, and storytelling that could last for days, bringing the myths of the gods vividly to life. The whole community feasted them, housed them, and showered them with gifts. They were the celebrities of their world. Back across the islands, in places of deep quiet, Another rare practice was unfolding, one that left no monuments at all. The sacred schools of learning, special houses where chosen students were shut away to learn the most precious and secret knowledge of the people, directly from the master keepers of memory. What they learned there staggers the modern mind. Genealogies tracing dozens of generations, the histories of every great voyage, the sacred chants, the laws, the names of the gods. Thousands upon thousands of lines, all to be held perfectly in memory, recited without a single error, and one day passed on to the next chosen few. And then there were the feats that seemed to defy nature itself. In parts of Polynesia, priests and chosen men performed a ritual that left witnesses speechless. They walked across stones heated until they glowed, white-hot, in a great pit. Barefoot, slowly, and they came away unburned. The firewalkers prepared with sacred ritual and unshakable belief, and then stepped out onto the burning stones, one calm pace after another, as the crowd watched in awe. To this day, the practice survives in places, and it still amazes everyone who sees it. For the Polynesians, it was proof of the power of the sacred over the flesh. Stone giants that walked across an island, sacred fleets of holy performers, schools that turned the human mind into a library, men who walked through fire. These were not the practices of a simple people. They were the achievements of a civilization confident in its power, certain of its place in the universe, and unafraid to attempt the impossible. For 3,000 years, this world endured and flourished and reached heights that still astonish us. But no world lasts forever untouched. New sails were coming over the horizon, and with them would come changes so vast that the descendants of these bold voyagers are still living through the consequences today. This is where their ancient story meets our own. When those foreign sails finally reached the islands, they changed everything. The newcomers brought new tools and new ideas, but they also brought diseases the islanders had never known, against which their bodies had no defense, and whole communities were swept away. They brought new gods, new rulers, and new laws. The ancient world began to come apart, and quietly, in the background, something precious began to slip away. The old voyaging stopped, the great canoes were no longer built, and the sacred knowledge of the navigators, the star paths held in memory for 100 generations, began to fade from the islands. By the middle of the 20th century, it was almost entirely gone. Some outsiders even claimed the ancestors had never truly navigated at all, that the settling of the Pacific had been a series of lucky accidents, drifters blown onto islands by chance. To the descendants of the greatest seafarers in history, it was a painful insult. And in the 1970s, a group of them set out to prove it wrong. They built a great double-hulled canoe in the old style and named her Hōkūleʻa after a guiding star. There was just one problem. The art of navigating her, without instruments, had been lost in Hawaii generations before. So they searched the wider Pacific and found one of the last living master navigators, a man named Maui, willing to teach them. In 1976, Hōkūleʻa set sail from Hawaii for Tahiti, guided only by the stars, the swells, and the birds, exactly as the ancestors had done. For 34 days, she crossed nearly 3,000 miles of open ocean, with no compass and no charts. And then, against all the doubts, she found the tiny target of Tahiti, dead ahead. The moment she arrived, the shores of Tahiti were packed with people, thousands upon thousands of them, who had gathered to witness the impossible. Their long-lost cousins had come home across the sea, the old way, just as the legends said. For many, it was the first time in their lives they felt the full weight of who their ancestors had been. That single voyage lit a fire across the entire Pacific. A great reawakening began. People who had been taught to feel ashamed of their heritage now embraced it with fierce pride. The languages came back. The dances came back. The sacred tattoos came back. A whole generation rediscovered that they were the children of the boldest explorers the world had ever known. A new generation of navigators trained, learning to read the heavens once more. One of them, Nainoa Thompson, became the first Hawaiian in centuries to guide a canoe across the ocean by the stars, and devoted his life to passing the knowledge on. The chain that had nearly been broken was being carefully, lovingly mended, and Hōkūleʻa kept sailing. In an epic journey that lasted 3 years, she circled the entire globe, covering tens of thousands of miles of open ocean, carrying a message of hope and care for the earth to the whole world. The canoe that began as a single act of pride had become a symbol for an entire people. But even as the old spirit was rising, a new and terrible danger was rising too. The very ocean that these people had mastered, the ocean that gave them everything, had begun, slowly, to climb. And nowhere on Earth is that danger more real, or more heartbreaking, than on a tiny chain of islands called Tuvalu. Tuvalu is home to around 11,000 people, living on 9 slivers of coral scattered across the Pacific. And it is almost unimaginably low. At its highest point, the land rises barely 2 meters above the waves. There are no hills to climb to, no higher ground to run to. There is only the sea, all around and rising. The signs are already here. When the great tides come now, the sea pushes up through the very ground itself, bubbling out of the earth and flooding the land from below. Salt water seeps into the wells and poisons the soil. The taro pits, where families have grown their food for centuries, are slowly being killed by the sea. Imagine for a moment what this means to a family there. To stand in the home your grandparents built, and know that one day, not far off, it will be underwater. To watch your children play on a beach that is shrinking, year by year, beneath their feet. This is not a distant warning. For Tuvalu, it is happening now. And so the people of Tuvalu have begun, with breaking hearts, to prepare for the unthinkable. To leave. A special agreement with Australia now offers them a pathway to move away, to safety, as the waters close in. By 2025, the overwhelming majority of Tuvaluans, more than 9 in 10, had put their names forward for a chance to go. Think of what is being asked of them. To leave is not just to lose a house, it is to lose the land that holds your ancestors' graves. The reef your family has fished for generations. The very ground that answers the question, where are you from? For a people whose identity is rooted in their islands, it is a wound almost too deep to name. But the Tuvaluans refuse to simply vanish. Their leaders have taken their case to the entire world. One of their ministers once stood and delivered a speech to a global climate summit while standing knee-deep in the rising seawater, so the world could not look away from what was coming. And they have done something no nation has ever done before. They have begun to build a copy of their entire country in the digital world. Their islands, their landmarks, their records, all preserved in the cloud, so that even if the physical land disappears beneath the ocean, Tuvalu, its memory and its identity might somehow live on. The world has begun, slowly, to respond. In 2025, an international court declared something remarkable, that even if a country's land is swallowed by the sea, the nation itself, its sovereignty, its place among the peoples of the world, does not have to die with it. A country, the court said, can outlive its own drowning shore. The leader of Tuvalu has put it simply and powerfully. The rising seas, he has said, will never erase us. It is the same defiance, the same refusal to be beaten by the ocean, that drove their ancestors to climb into canoes and sail into the unknown 3,000 years ago. The spirit has not died. It has only met a new and terrible test. So here is where the ancient story and our own collide. The descendants of the people who conquered this ocean are now fighting to keep that same ocean from conquering them. On one horizon, a voyaging canoe sails proudly into the future. On another, a homeland slips quietly beneath the tide. Both are happening right now, to the children of the wind and water. What happens next is not yet written. Whether the world acts in time, whether these islands can be saved or only remembered. But one thing the long story of the Polynesians makes absolutely certain: this is a people who have never, not once in 3,000 years, been willing to give up in the face of the sea. 3,000 years ago, they looked at the largest ocean on Earth, an ocean that should have stopped them cold, and they decided to cross it anyway. Now, facing the greatest challenge of all, the question that remains is the same one their ancestors answered so long ago. When the sea stands before you, do you turn back? Or do you find a way? So let us return one last time to where we began, to a single canoe, alone on the largest ocean on Earth, with no land in any direction. But now you see it differently, because now you know who is aboard, and you know they are not lost at all. The people on that canoe were among the most skilled human beings who have ever lived. They held an entire ocean inside their minds, and they crossed it on purpose, again and again, when the rest of the world still clung fearfully to the sight of its own coastlines. From a single route in distant Asia, they spread across a third of the planet. They filled a triangle of ocean larger than any empire, reaching the last habitable lands on Earth. It was, quite simply, the greatest feat of exploration in all of human history. And they did it without a map, without metal, and without a single written word. And here is the truth at the very heart of their story. The Polynesians were never defined by where they landed. They were defined by their courage to leave the shore, by their willingness, again and again, to push off into the unknown, trusting their knowledge, their canoe, and each other, against an ocean that could swallow them whole. To them, the ocean was never an enemy and never an emptiness. It was a road. It was a home. It was, in the deepest sense, an ancestor. The sea had carried their forefathers to every island, and one day they believed it would carry their spirits home again. They did not live beside the ocean. They belonged to it, and everything they were, they carried not in books, but in themselves, in the chants they memorized, in the dances they performed, in the marks they carved into their own skin. For these people, to remember was to survive. Their entire civilization lived inside the human heart and was handed with love from one generation to the next. They built kingdoms ruled by sacred chiefs. They raised stone giants that walked. They feasted whole villages from ovens dug into the earth. They filled their world with gods and law and beauty. On islands at the very end of the world, with almost nothing, they built almost everything. And now, in our own time, comes the cruelest twist of all. The very ocean that carried them to safety has begun to rise against the children they left behind. The sea that was their salvation has become, for some of them, a slow and rising threat to the only home they have ever known. Yet the spirit that crossed this ocean 3,000 years ago has not been drowned. It sails again, in canoes guided once more by the stars. It dances again, in festivals from Hawaii to Aotearoa. It speaks again, in languages rescued from the edge of silence. The fire that the first voyagers lit is still burning, because if their long story tells us anything, it is this. These are a people who, when the whole ocean stood against them, chose not to turn back, but to find a way across. That courage carried them to the ends of the earth. And it is that same courage they call upon now. Their story leaves a question hanging over all of us. About courage in the face of the impossible. About what we choose to remember and what we let slip away. And about how we care for the great ocean that connects every shore on this single fragile planet we all share. The children of the wind and water are still out there, still reading the stars, still listening to the swells, still sailing against all the odds toward a horizon no one else can see. They always have. And if their 3,000 years have proven anything at all, they always will.